Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The carriage rumbled steadily through the streets of King's Landing, its wheels creaking under the weight of fine wood and gilded trim, moving with measured grace through the crowded city. The scent of salt and smoke clung to the air, mingling with the faint aroma of roasting meat from the market stalls. Within the carriage, Lady Rosenheitwer sat poised, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her fingers twitched against the silk of her gown. She could hear the distant clang of blacksmiths working, the hum of voices rising like an unending tide, but her mind remained anchored to the imposing figure waiting at the red keep, her father, Otto Heitwer. Beside her, Lady Maleria Heitwer, her mother, sat with an air of composed resignation. Though outwardly calm, Rosen knew the woman was quietly mourning the life they had left behind in Old Town. Rosen's younger siblings, Wayne and Alicent, were nestled opposite her. Gawain, at 5 summers, pressed his face against the carriage window, enchanted by the sight of the capital. Alicent, only 3, clutched their mother's hand, unaware of the gravity of their arrival. "Why must we come to court?" Rosen finally asked, her voice carefully measured, but edged with irritation. The city was a world apart from Old Town, where she had spent her years in peaceful study, away from the web of ambitions her father wove. Lady Maleria exhaled softly, her fingers stroking Alicent's hair. "Because your father has been made hand of the king," she replied, "and it is our duty to stand by him." Duty, the word lingered between them, heavy with unspoken truths. The carriage slowed as they neared the towering gates of the Red Keep, the guards stepping forward to receive them. As soon as the door swung open, the warm light of the afternoon sun spilled inside, illuminating the shadowed interior. Rosen stepped down, her skirts sweeping over the stone as she glanced up at the fortress that would now be her home. At the top of the steps, Otto Heitwer stood, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp gaze sweeping over them all. His expression barely shifted as they approached, though Rosen caught the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, pride, calculation, or both. "Lady wife," Otto greeted with a curt nod toward Maleria, before shifting his gaze to his children. He examined them with the same critical eye he cast upon royal decrees. Finally, his attention landed on Rosen. "I have secured a place for you in the household of Queen Ima." The weight of his words settled over her like an iron yoke. Queen Ima, wife of Prince Viserys Targaryen, the man recently declared heir to the Iron Throne, shoulders. Instead, she lowered her gaze, allowing only a slight, imperceptible breath to slip from her lips. "Of course, Father," she murmured. Without further ceremony, Otto turned, leading the way into the castle. The air within the keep was thick with the scent of burning torches, warm bread, and something distinctly metallic. As Rosen followed, the weight of her new life pressed upon her shoulders. The Queen's chambers were a whirlwind of movement when Rosen was finally ushered inside. Ladies-in-waiting adjusted cushions, whispered amongst themselves, and tended to Ima Arin, who reclined near the open window, one hand resting on the swell of her stomach. At her feet, Princess Rhaenyra played quietly, a girl of only 4 summers, her Valyrian silver-gold curls catching the light. "My lady, may I present my daughter, Rosen Heitwer," Otto announced, bowing his head. Rosen followed suit, sinking into a practiced curtsy. Ima's gaze swept over her with quiet scrutiny before offering a polite smile. "Welcome to court, Lady Rosen. I trust you will find yourself most welcome here." Rosen dipped her head in acknowledgement. "I am honored, Your Grace." She could feel her father's gaze burning into the back of her head, silent yet expectant. She was here to prove her worth, to ensure that House Heitwer remained indispensable. The Queen gestured toward a seat beside her. "Come, sit with me. I imagine your journey from Old Town was long." As Rosen took her place, she felt a shift in the air, the subtle, unseen forces of power and expectation swirling around her. She was no longer just the daughter of Otto Heitwer. She was now a piece in a game as old as the realm itself, and the game had only just begun. The halls of the Red Keep were a labyrinth of stone and shadow, every corridor lined with flickering torches that cast long, wavering figures against the walls. Rosen moved through them with careful steps, the unfamiliar layout leaving her uncertain of her path. Gone were the familiar corridors of Old Town, where she had known every corner, every hidden alcove. Here, everything looked the same, cold, imposing, and indifferent. She had spent her first days at court learning the intricacies of her new life, serving in Queen Ima's household with quiet diligence. The Queen was kind, though burdened by the weight of expectation. Her pregnancy had left her weary, and the hushed conversations among her ladies spoke of fears that no one dared voice aloud. The realm needed a male heir, and Ima had suffered loss after loss in her attempts to provide one. This morning, Rosen had been expected to attend to the Queen, yet once again she had lost her way. The halls twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, and the subtle smirks of passing courtiers told her they recognized her struggle. She pressed forward, determined not to appear foolish, until a sudden voice dipped into a swift curtsy, her mind scrambling to recall his name. She knew of Prince Viserys, of course, but this man was younger, his gaze sharper, his presence less tempered. "My apologies, my lord," Rosen murmured. "I seem to have lost my way." His smirk deepened. "Then it is surely my duty to see you safely to your destination." Rosen hesitated. To accept his help meant acknowledging her own failure, but refusing could be seen as rudeness. Court was a place of games, and she was only beginning to understand the rules. Finally, she nodded. "I would be grateful," she said. The prince offered his arm, and after a beat of hesitation, Rosen took it. His pace was unhurried as he guided her through the winding halls, his expression one of easy amusement. "You are one of Otto Hightower's daughters, aren't you?" he asked after a moment. "I am," Rosen replied cautiously. He glanced down at her, eyes gleaming. And yet, I had not heard that the Hand's daughter was so striking. Rosen fought the urge to roll her eyes. She had been at court mere days, and had already learned that Targaryens, this one in particular, enjoyed their charm a little too much. "You are kind to say so, my prince," she replied, keeping her tone polite but distant. He chuckled. "Ah, so you do know who I am." At last, the pieces aligned in her mind. Prince Demon, younger brother to Viserys, a rogue in every whispered tale she had overheard. She had not recognized him at first, but now, with his name clear in her mind, she was aware of the stories surrounding him. She said nothing, and he seemed to revel in her silence. They walked in comfortable tension, his presence undeniably magnetic, until finally they arrived at the doors to Queen Emma's chambers. Rosen released his arm, offering a small but formal smile. "Thank you for your kindness, Prince Demon." His smirk returned, slower this time, more deliberate. "The pleasure was mine, Lady Rosen." As he turned and walked away, Rosen found herself exhaling, uncertain why she had been holding her breath. The moment passed, but a strange feeling lingered, one she could not yet name. She straightened her shoulders and stepped inside the Queen's chambers, pushing all thoughts of demon from her mind. There were far more important matters at hand. Emma sat near the hearth, her hands folded over her swollen belly, her face pale with exhaustion. Lady Lena, one of her older attendants, knelt beside her you were raised in Old Town, Ema mused. Did you enjoy it? Rosen hesitated before nodding. I did. It was home. Ema smiled faintly. I understand that. The Vale was my home before I came here. Her expression turned wistful. It is not easy leaving the place where you feel you belong. No, Rosen agreed quietly. The silence between them was comfortable, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Ema sighed. I do not know what will come of this pregnancy, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I pray every day, but she did not finish. But she did not need to. Rosen could see the fear in her eyes. The weight of expectation was crushing her, and the burden of producing an heir was one she had borne for too long. Rosen reached forward, hesitating only a moment before taking the Queen's hand in hers. Ema blinked, surprised by the gesture, but did not pull away. You are strong, Your Grace, Rosen said softly. No matter what happens, you are not alone. Ema's lips pressed together, her fingers tightening around Rosen's. Thank you, she murmured. The moment passed, and soon the duties of the day resumed. But as Rosen moved through her tasks, the words of Prince Demon lingered in her mind, his voice curling through her thoughts like a whispered promise, and she had the sinking feeling that their paths would cross again. The silence in the Queen's chambers was broken only by the soft crackle of the hearth, the occasional rustle of fabric as the attendants moved about their tasks. Rosen sat by the window, gazing out over the vast sprawl of King's Landing. The city was a living beast, its breath heavy with the scent of the harbor, its pulse set by the ceaseless movement of its people. She was still adjusting to its rhythm, still learning how to navigate the labyrinth of ambition and expectation that made up court life. She had begun to understand the unspoken rules, how smiles masked hidden intentions, how words carried different meanings depending on who spoke them. Queen Ema was a kind mistress, but even in her warmth, Rosen could sense the undercurrents of her burden. Every glance, every whisper was laced with the unrelenting pressure for her to produce a living son. Rosen was deep in thought when the chamber doors swung open with an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. The Meister entered first, his expression grim, followed by Sir Otto Heitworth. Her father's presence alone was enough to signal that something was terribly wrong. Ema, seated in her cushioned chair, immediately sat upright. What is it? The Meister hesitated, casting a quick glance at Otto before stepping forward. Your Grace, the labor has begun. Ema's breath hitched, her fingers clenching against the arm of her chair. Rosen's stomach tightened. This was too soon. The Queen was not yet due. The attendants moved quickly, their voices hushed, but urgent as they prepared the chamber for what queen was helped to her feet and led toward the birthing bed. The air in the chamber thickened with tension, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing against them all. She wanted to help, to do something, but there was nothing she could offer beyond silent support. As Ema was eased onto the bed, Rosen felt a hand on her arm. She turned, finding herself face to face with her father. "Come with me," Otto murmured. She frowned, but the queen— "You will be of no use to her now," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "There is something else that requires your attention." Reluctantly, Rosen followed. They walked in silence, Otto's steps purposeful, Rosen's mind racing. He had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was playing a move in whatever grand game he was always orchestrating. They reached a quiet corridor, away from the bustle of the main halls. Standing there, as if waiting, was Prince Demon. Rosen stiffened. Otto came to a halt, his expression unreadable as he turned to her. "You will speak with the prince." Rosen's brows furrowed. "For what purpose?" Demon smirked, arms crossed over his chest, as he observed their exchange with lazy amusement. "Perhaps your father hopes my presence will serve as a distraction from the rather unfortunate business happening elsewhere in the keep." Otto ignored him, his gaze steady on Rosen. "Do as I say." She clenched her jaw, but inclined her head in reluctant obedience. Otto turned and strode away without another word, leaving her standing in the dimly lit corridor with Demon Targaryen. The prince watched her, his smirk unwavering. "I must say, your father does have a talent for using his own blood as pieces in his games." Rosen's lips pressed into a thin line. "You assume much, my prince." Demon stepped closer, his presence commanding even in stillness. "Do I?" His voice was softer now, almost teasing. "Perhaps I only see the truth of it before you do." She held his gaze, refusing to let him rattle her. "Why are you here?" His smirk faltered just slightly. He exhaled, glancing toward the direction of the queen's chambers before looking back at her. "Because I have a feeling that, by night's end, everything will change." A chill settled in Rosen's chest. She didn't know if it was from his words or the way he said them. They stood there in silence, neither willing to break first. And somewhere beyond these halls, the cries of a laboring queen echoed through the castle. The night stretched long, heavy with grief. The bells rang at dawn, their toll carrying across the city, sending ripples of sorrow through the streets of King's Landing. The news spread like wildfire. Queen Ema was dead, and so was the child she bore. Rosen stood at the edge of the funeral procession, her hands clasped tightly before her, the cold morning air biting at her skin. The pyre burned bright his expression vacant, hollowed by loss. Otto Heitor was at his side, ever the loyal hand, murmuring quiet words that Rosen could not hear. But she did not have to hear them to know what they were. Viserys was a king without a male heir, and in the wake of such grief, his judgment would be clouded. The court was already whispering. Rosen did not have to turn to know that Demon was near. She could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze, as he observed the scene unfold. He stepped beside her, his voice low. "And so it begins." She inhaled sharply, but said nothing, because she knew he was right. This was not just the funeral of a queen. It was the opening move in a battle that had not yet begun. The air in the Red Keep was different now. Grief had settled into the stones, lurking in the shadows of every corridor. The halls were quieter, the courtiers walking with subdued steps, speaking in hushed tones, as if the very walls might listen. The pyre had long since burned out, but its embers had not cooled. Rosen could feel it in the way people watched the king, the way Otto Heitor loomed closer, whispering into his ear. She had seen it before, the way her father maneuvered people like pieces on a board. And now, he was moving the most important piece of all, Viserys himself. She knew, without needing to be told, that her father had already set his plans in motion. Rosen stood by the window of her chambers, the morning light casting long shadows across the stone floor. The sky beyond was painted with the pale hues of dawn, but there was no peace to be found in the view. She could not stop thinking about the night before the moment the flames consumed Queen Emma's body, the quiet presence of Demon beside her, his words lingering in her mind. And so it begins. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned as the door opened, revealing Alicent, her little sister's face drawn with uncertainty. "Father wishes to see you," Alicent murmured. Rosen studied her sister's expression. She was too young to fully understand the depth of what was happening, but she knew enough to be wary. Taking a slow breath, Rosen nodded. "Very well." As she followed Alicent down the halls, she could feel the weight of eyes upon her. The courtiers had taken notice of her father's sudden interest in her movements, and she was not naive enough to believe they thought nothing of it. In King's Landing, a daughter of Otto Heitor did not move without purpose. They entered the chamber where Otto awaited. He stood at the center of the room, dressed in the deep green of House Heitor, his expression unreadable. Beside him, several courtiers murmured amongst themselves, but as Rosen entered, they fell silent. Otto gestured for Alicent to leave, and after a moment's hesitation, she obeyed, closing the door behind her. Rosen folded her hands in front of her, waiting. She would not speak first. That was another lesson she hesitated, carefully choosing her words. Be at the king's side so soon after the queen's passing. Otto's expression did not change. The realm must move forward, Rosen, and House Heitor must secure its place in it. Her pulse quickened. She had always known that she would not have the luxury of choosing her own future, but she had not expected it to come this swiftly, nor in this manner. She was to be a pawn in her father's ambitions. You wish for him to marry me, she said quietly. And for the first time, Otto's mask slipped, if only slightly. You are young, he said instead. Perhaps too young, but there is another who can serve this role just as well. Rosen's brows furrowed until she realized who he meant. Alicent. A sharp chill spread through her. She is only a child, Rosen said, her voice colder than she had intended. Otto's gaze darkened. She is a daughter of House Heitor. Rosen felt her hands clench at her sides. This was not a request. It never was with Otto. It was an inevitability, and she was powerless to stop it. She had spent her life watching him shape the future to his will. And now, he was shaping Alicent. For the first time, she hated him for it. She forced her expression into something neutral, unwilling to let him see the storm brewing beneath her skin. And what would you have me do? Otto's expression softened again. But now she could see the deception beneath it, the quiet manipulation woven into every word. Be close to the king, he said simply, and be watchful. Rosen swallowed the bile rising in her throat and nodded. She left the chamber with careful steps, her face calm, her hands steady. But as she walked, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Her father was playing his game, and he had placed Alicent on the board. Rosen would not allow her sister to be swallowed by it. The next time she saw Demon Targaryen, it was not by accident. He found her in the royal gardens, where she had retreated for a moment of solitude. His approach was silent, but she felt his presence before she saw him. Strange, he mused as he came to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the distant towers of the keep. I never took you for the sort to wander alone. Rosen exhaled, knowing better than to ask how he had found her. Perhaps I needed a moment away from all the scheming. Demon chuckled. Then you are in the wrong city, my lady. She turned to him then, studying his face. There was something different in his expression, less amusement, more calculation. You've heard, she said. His smirk deepened. That your father is making his move. Of course. He plays the game well, but he is not the only one with ambition. Rosen frowned. What do you mean? Demon turned fully to her, his eyes gleaming. Do you think I will simply sit back and watch as Otto Heitor bends my brother to his will? He tilted his head slightly. I have my own plans, my lady. Await on how much you are willing to defy your father. She met his gaze, unflinching. The battle for the future of the realm had begun, and Rosen was caught in the center of it. The throne room was thick with tension, the air charged with unspoken words. The courtiers stood in clusters, whispering behind jeweled hands, their gazes darting toward the iron throne where Viserys sat, his face still shadowed with grief. The loss of Queen Aemma lingered in every corner of the Red Keep, but time waited for no man, least of all a king. Rosen stood among the assembled nobility, her posture straight, her hands clasped before her as she watched her father step forward. Otto Hightower moved with the careful grace of a man who knew that every word he spoke carried weight. The realm must have stability, Your Grace, Otto said, his voice measured and calm. It has been weeks since the Queen's passing, and the question of succession remains unresolved. Viserys exhaled sharply, gripping the arms of the throne. Must we discuss this now? Otto inclined his head. Now more than ever, my king. The great houses look to you for guidance. They must know where your favor falls. The room was silent, every noble awaiting his response. Rosen watched her father carefully. She had long since learned to recognize the subtleties in his expression, the slight tightening around his mouth, the careful flicker of his eyes. He was playing his move now, positioning his next piece. The council has spoken of potential alliances, Otto continued. A marriage would not only strengthen your reign, but secure the future of the Targaryen line. Viserys shifted uncomfortably. And what would you suggest, Otto? Otto hesitated, but only for effect. Then, with carefully practiced neutrality, he said, "The Lady Lena Velaryon is of age." A ripple of murmurs spread through the court. House Velaryon was powerful, their fleet unmatched. A marriage between Viserys and Lena would strengthen the realm, but it was not the only suggestion hanging in the air. Rosen felt her breath catch as Otto spoke again. However, he said smoothly, "There is another who would serve just as well. One who is already known to you. One who has proven her loyalty." He turned slightly, his gaze landing on her sister. Alicent. The murmurs grew louder, the nobles shifting. Rosen's grip on her own wrist tightened. She had known this moment was coming, but to see it unfold so publicly, to watch her father put her sister before the realm, as though she were nothing more than a carefully placed offering, it sickened her. Alicent stood still, her expression composed, but her fingers trembling at her sides. Rosen knew her sister, knew the way she bit her lip when she was nervous, knew how she twined her hands together when she wished to disappear into herself. Viserys looked startled, his brow furrowing as he regarded Alicent. Rosen felt rubbing a hand over his face. "This is not a decision I will make lightly." Otto bowed his head. "Of course not, Your Grace, but it is one that must be made soon." The king's silence stretched, and Rosen knew then that her father had already won. Viceroys would choose a Lysant. He would not see the game for what it was. He would only see the kindness of a girl who had been at his side, offering him comfort. Otto had made sure of that. That night, Rosen found a Lysant sitting by the hearth in their chambers, staring into the flames. "You should have refused," Rosen said quietly. A Lysant did not look at her. And what would that have changed? Rosen sat beside her, reaching for her hand. "It is not too late." A Lysant exhaled, closing her eyes briefly. "It is." Rosen felt something ache inside her. They had always been close, even with their age difference. A Lysant had been the soft one, the gentle one, while Rosen had learned to keep her emotions guarded. But now, for the first time, Rosen felt powerless. "What do you want?" Rosen asked. A Lysant turned to her, her eyes shining. "It does not matter what I want." Rosen's jaw tightened. Their father had ensured that. Demon found her later, standing alone on one of the keep's many balconies, staring out at the city below. "So it has come to this," he murmured, stepping beside her. Rosen did not look at him. "It was always going to." He huffed a soft laugh. "And yet you seem surprised." She turned to him then, her gaze sharp. "Do not mistake my anger for surprise." Demon studied her, his smirk fatting. "And what will you do?" Rosen hesitated. She did not know. What power did she have against her father? Against the weight of the crown? She looked away. Nothing. Demon clicked his tongue in disappointment. Pity. Her eyes snapped back to him. "And what would you have me do?" "Challenge the king's decision. Defy my father openly." She shook her head. "That is not the way this world works." Demon tilted his head, his eyes gleaming. "No, it is. But that doesn't mean you cannot play your own game." Rosen frowned. "And what game do you suggest?" His smirk returned. "One where you stop letting Otto Heitor dictate your future." She exhaled slowly, considering him. Demon was reckless, dangerous, but he was not a fool. He saw the truth of things, and though his ambitions were his own, he was not wrong in what he said. For too long, she had played the dutiful daughter. But as she watched the way the court moved, the way power shifted like sand beneath their feet, she realized something. Her father did not control everything. Not yet. And perhaps, just perhaps, she had more to offer this game than he ever anticipated. She met Demon's gaze, her expression unreadable. "If I were to play my own game, what role would you play in it?" Demon's grin widened. "Why, my lady, I would two are often the same. She held his gaze for a long moment before finally turning away. Perhaps it was time. She learned how to play the game after all. The bells of the great sept tolled at dusk, their somber chime rolling over the city like a slow-moving tide. The realm mourned, though the tears were not for Queen Ema. The long reign of King Yehares had come to an end. Rosen stood at the edge of the gathered nobility, clad in mourning black, her face composed despite the weight of the moment. Yehares had ruled for over 50 years, longer than any Targaryen before him. His passing left a void, one that the court would soon scramble to fill. Viceroys had been declared heir at the Great Council, but now, for the first time, the crown truly rested on his head, and her father, Otto Hightower, was closer to power than he had ever been. As the pyre was lit, Rosen glanced sideways, her eyes catching on the figure of Prince Demon. He stood apart from the rest of the gathered lords, his silver gold hair reflecting the firelight, his expression unreadable. He felt it, too, the shift in the air, the tension tightening around them like a noose. When the flames had turned the Dragon King to ash, the court moved as one, sweeping toward the Red Keep, where the next chapter of history would be written. Otto was already at Viceroy's side as they returned to the throne room. Rosen watched from a distance, standing with Alicent as the nobles knelt before their new king. Long live King Viceroys, they intoned, voices echoing through the vast hall. Rosen lowered her gaze, speaking the words even as a cold certainty settled in her stomach. The game had begun in earnest. That night, the corridors of the Red Keep were alive with quiet whispers. Lords and ladies gathered in private corners, speaking in hushed voices about what would come next. Rosen knew where her father was. He would be in council with the king, his plans unfolding as smoothly as ever. She had spent years watching him maneuver, but tonight she would act. She found Demon in the shadows of a secluded hallway, leaning against the stone as if he had been waiting for her. "You look troubled, Lady Rosen," he murmured. She did not bother with pleasantries. exhaled. But I need an ally. Demon tilted his head. And you think me trustworthy? No, she admitted. But I do think you're dangerous enough to make it worth the risk. He laughed at that, low and pleased. You're learning, my lady. She ignored the way her pulse quickened at his words. Are you in? Demon stepped closer, his voice lowering. I am always in. Rosen took a breath. It was time to make her move. The torches lining the halls of the Red Keep flickered as a warm evening breeze crept through the open archways. Despite the beauty of the starlit sky beyond, the castle felt like a cage. Rosen walked with measured steps, her silk skirts whispering against the stone floor. She was heading toward the royal chambers, though every instinct screamed at her to turn away. Her father's orders had been clear. She was to ensure that Alyson continued to be a source of comfort for the king. She had not been outright told to encourage her sister's attachment to Viserys, but the implication was there, hanging in the air like the sharp scent of a freshly whetted blade. She clenched her fists at her sides. In the great hall, courtiers still lingered, drinking and talking in hushed voices. The kingdom had been in mourning for weeks, but tonight there was laughter in the corners, a different energy in the air. The moment of transition was upon them, and those who wished to claim influence over the new king had begun to make their moves. She caught sight of Demon across the room before he saw her. He was draped lazily in his chair, legs stretched out, a goblet dangling from his fingers. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed his otherwise careless posture. He was watching everything, every word spoken, every alliance forming in real time. He turned then, catching her gaze. A slow smirk curved his lips. Rosen should have looked away. Instead, she held a stare. Demon rose, dismissing the Lord speaking beside him with a mere flick of his hand. He moved toward her like a shadow slipping between candlelight, his confidence effortless, as though he owned the very ground he walked upon. My lady, he murmured, his voice laced with amusement. A rare sight, you, standing amidst the wolves. Rosen tilted her head. You do not consider yourself one of them. Oh, I do, he grinned. But I never pretend to be anything else. Her lips parted slightly at his honesty. His gaze flicked past her toward the doors that led to Viserys' chambers. Off to see the king. Rosen tensed. I go to see my sister. Demon hummed, as if considering that. And does your sister wish to be seen? Rosen narrowed her eyes. If you have something to say, say it. Demon leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. I think that if she were truly unwilling, she would have fled by now. Rosen felt a sharp pang in her chest, but she refused to show it. She is young, she said instead, and Viserys is desperate. Refuse the king. Refuse father. She turned then, her eyes sad but steady. I have no choice, Rosen. Rosen swallowed hard, fighting the sharp surge of helplessness rising in her throat. Alicent reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. But neither do you. Rosen exhaled. She hated how right Alicent was. House Heitor was rising, and they were being dragged up with it, whether they wanted to or not. The throne room was filled with the hum of conversation. Lords and ladies draped in finery, their whispers carrying like the rustling of silk. Tonight was not a night of mourning. It was a night of ascension. King Viserys would announce his new queen. Rosen stood at the edge of the gathering, her fingers curled against the fabric of her gown. She had known this moment would come, had felt the inevitability of it pressing down on her for weeks. And yet, seeing Alicent standing near the king, her face carefully composed, her hands folded in perfect grace, made it feel all too real. This was no longer a game of whispers and quiet maneuvering. It was reality, set in stone. Otto Heitor stood beside the king, his expression unreadable. Though Rosen knew better, he was victorious. The moment he had spent years crafting had arrived. His daughter, the queen. A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall as Viserys stood from the Iron Throne, clearing his throat. I have given much thought to the future of the realm, he began, his voice steady, though grief still clung to its edges. To the stability of the kingdom and the line of succession. I have made my choice. The entire court held its breath. Viserys turned slightly, his gaze settling on Alicent. I will take Alicent Heitor as my wife and queen. The room erupted in a mixture of applause and stunned whispers. The Velarrians, whose daughter had also been a contender, stood silent and still, their expressions betraying nothing. But Rosen saw the sharp flicker of fury in Lord Corley's eyes before he turned on his heel and left the hall. His wife, Princess Rhaenys, following closely behind. This would have consequences. Rosen looked at Alicent. Her sister wore a soft, practiced smile, the perfect image of duty and grace. But Rosen knew her better than anyone, and she saw it, the briefest flicker of something behind her gaze. Fear. Rosen's stomach twisted. A hand brushed against her arm. She turned sharply, only to find Demon standing beside her, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. So it is done, he murmured, swirling the wine in his goblet. Rosen exhaled, barely shaking her head. It is only beginning. Demon's lips curled at the edges. You see clearly now. She glanced back at Alicent, then at her father, who was basking in the weight of his success. Clearer than ever, she whispered. Demon took a sip of his wine. watching her with interest. "And what will you do with that clarity?" Rosen lifted her chin slightly, feeling something shift inside her. She had spent too long playing her father's game, watching, learning, letting others decide her fate. No more. Alicent had been claimed by the throne. Rosen would not let herself be next. "I think," she said slowly, turning to meet Demon's gaze, "that it is time I start playing my own game." His smirk widened. "Now, that is a game I would very much like to see." The crowd began to move, the lords and ladies pressing forward to offer their blessings to the soon-to-be queen. Otto caught Rosen's eye across the room. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the warning in it. He had secured his victory tonight.